When my son Daniel spoke to me that afternoon in our small house in Willow Creek, he did not once raise his eyes to meet mine. From now on, Mom, the bank will transfer your retirement directly into my account, he murmured while scrolling through his phone, and he added that I did not need money anymore and only required a corner of the house to grow old and die. The spoon slipped from my hand and hit the kitchen tile with a metallic crack that echoed like a gunshot in my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words tangled against my throat and refused to come out. Daniel never looked up from the glowing screen and continued tapping at it as though he were speaking to a stranger. In that moment, at 70 years old, I felt my own child erase my existence as easily as one deletes a message. I swallowed hard, picked up the spoon, and stood quietly in front of the stove. The stew I had been making for the two of us kept bubbling, but its familiar aroma, once so comforting, now churned my stomach. The house that had once been my pride suddenly felt foreign. That night, as the old clock struck 11, I sat alone in the dark dining room, listening to the heavy silence of a home that no longer loved me, while from down the hall I heard the laughter of Camille, his wife, echoing from their bedroom. That woman had accomplished what neither poverty nor widowhood ever could. She had stripped my son of the last traces of tenderness he once carried in his heart. Since they had married, everything changed. The home that had once been a refuge had become a cage. And every time I heard her soft, triumphant laugh, I remembered the first day we met. She had been young, pretty, with polished manners that tried to hide her arrogance. "Your son has such a good heart, Mrs. Porter," she had said as I poured her coffee. I had no idea that years later she would carve that very heart out piece by piece. That night, I did not turn on my bedroom lamp. The air smelled of humidity and something like grief. On my nightstand rested a photograph of Daniel at 8 years old, toothless and grinning while hugging the stray dog we rescued together. He was my entire life. I had worked 40 years as an elementary school teacher, rising before sunrise, sewing my own clothes, sacrificing every luxury to provide him the best I could. And now he no longer even called me Mom, only Evelyn. The tears stung, but I refused to let them fall. At this age, you learn that crying is useless when the heart has already broken. The next morning, Camille waited for me in the kitchen with a smile so false it almost glittered. "Evelyn," she said lightly while stirring her coffee, "do not take it the wrong way. Daniel only wants to help you. Help me by stealing my money. It is for your own good. At your age, you do not need much, and the bank paperwork is too complicated." Her words sounded sweet, but each one cut like a blade. "Do not worry, dear," I answered calmly. "I am not offended." She smiled as if she believed she had tamed me, not knowing that behind my calm a new strength was forming, one neither she nor my son had ever imagined. All day I acted normal. I made my bed and swept the floors and cooked like I always did, but while I washed the dishes, a dangerous idea took shape in the back of my mind. I was not going to cry or plead. I was simply going to do something that no one expected of me. I went to my room and opened the old wardrobe. Hidden beneath folded linens and an embroidered tablecloth rested a small tin box filled with forgotten things. Letters and photographs and antique coins, and a small glass bottle containing a clear liquid. It was concentrated bleach from my years cleaning classrooms after school. I lifted it and held it up to the light. I did not know its purpose yet, but I knew it would have one before nightfall. When evening came, I prepared dinner as usual: rice and stewed beef and warm bread. Daniel arrived home with the same cold expression he had adopted for months. "Did you finish the bank paperwork?" he asked without greeting. "Yes," I lied. "It is done." "Good," he said as he poured himself a glass of wine. "Camille and I will meet with the manager tomorrow." I nodded silently. Dinner passed without conversation, only the clinking of silverware and the faint noise of the television. When they went to sleep, I cleaned the table and waited. At midnight, I rose from bed. The silence in the house was thick enough to touch. I walked to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Its pale light filled the darkness as I placed a covered plate on the middle shelf. On it sat Daniel's favorite dessert, a homemade caramel custard, and beside it a glass pitcher of water. Everything looked normal, but hidden beneath a layer of plastic wrap I had tucked away the bank documents, the forged forms Daniel had used to steal my pension. I had retrieved them earlier when Camille left them carelessly on the table, unaware that I would recognize them instantly. Now they were sealed tight inside a bag of water resting in the freezer, hardening into solid ice. waiting for the moment they would save me. I knew Daniel would look for the documents the next morning, certain everything was under his control, and although I barely slept that night, a strange calm settled inside me, because for the first time in years, my fear had transformed into something sharper and stronger, something that felt dangerously close to power. Dawn arrived with the usual sounds of life in our small Willow Creek home: doors opening, footsteps across wooden floors, the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, and I was already seated when Daniel opened the refrigerator. Everything happened in mere seconds: first the silence, then the heavy thud of something hitting the floor, the shattering clink of glass, and finally his scream, a scream so piercing it seemed to shake the walls. But it was not pain he was feeling, it was pure fear. Camille ran in from the bedroom demanding to know what was happening, but Daniel could only point at the refrigerator with trembling hands. Inside, frozen inside a solid block of ice, floated the forged bank documents bearing both his signature and my own, and above them rested the note I had written: "Never underestimate a mother, not even an old one." I stood slowly, looked him directly in the eyes, and said, "Good morning, sweetheart. Would you like some coffee?" And he backed away pale and shaking while I, for the first time in years, felt a smile return to my face. The echo of the refrigerator door still rang in my ears as I sat near the window, the cold morning light barely illuminating the garden outside. And I realized my hands were shaking not from fear, but from the exhaustion of a lifetime of giving everything and receiving so little in return. My reflection in the window showed a woman I barely recognized: white hair, lined skin, tired eyes, yet somewhere beneath that worn face still lived the girl I once was. The girl who dreamed of a family and a gentle love, the girl who believed goodness was always rewarded. How naive I had been. I married Samuel when I was 22, a man with strong hands and an easy smile, and although we owned nothing but a rented room and a radio with constant static, happiness was simple back then. When our son was born, Samuel cried, his tears falling onto the baby like a vow to protect and cherish us for as long as he lived. And he kept that promise until the day he died far too young in a construction accident, leaving me at 36 with a 10-year-old boy, and a world suddenly split into the before and the after. The before smelled of warm bread, of Sundays in the park, of laughter, while the after smelled of unpaid bills and worry and nights where I cried into a pillow so Daniel would not hear. I worked every hour life allowed: mornings at the school teaching children, afternoons sewing clothes for strangers, evenings tutoring for extra money, and every sacrifice felt worthwhile whenever I watched Daniel sleeping peacefully. He once promised to buy me a little house with a garden, so I would never again live among the noise of the world, and I believed him. I was mother and father, teacher and nurse, protector and shadow, and I ensured every birthday had a cake and every winter had a coat, even if it meant going without food myself. I remember the night my shoes came apart, and I walked barefoot to the school just until the entrance so I wouldn't dirty the floors of my strict principal, a story no one knew except Daniel, who saw me and hugged me so tightly I thought I might break. I do not know when the change began, perhaps when he got his first job, when the light in his eyes shifted into something colder, something proud and dismissive. He stopped seeking my advice, stopped kissing my forehead, stopped sharing pieces of his life, and slowly I became something he seemed embarrassed to acknowledge. The first wound deep enough to scar came on his wedding day. Camille looked stunning, I will admit that, but during the ceremony when the minister asked him to thank his parents, Daniel turned only to her mother, leaving me invisible in the crowd. Later at the reception, they placed me at a table in the back, far from the guests, and Camille hugged me at the end with her polite smile and whispered that she would take care of him now and that I had done enough. Those words pierced deeper than any cruelty she ever inflicted later. "You have done enough," her elegant way of saying I was no longer needed. After the wedding came the years of distance. Daniel barely called, and when he did, it was only to ask for money or to know whether he could sell the small piece of land Samuel left us. I always agreed because I thought it might make him love me again, never understanding that love cannot be begged or bought. It was Camille's idea to move in with me after they sold their apartment, insisting they wanted to accompany me in my old age, and foolishly I believed this might heal us, not realizing they intended to take over my home. They rearranged everything, threw out my memories, and reduced my voice to something irrelevant and bothersome. At first, I still cooked for the three of us. Then they forbade me from using my own kitchen to avoid making a mess. And soon enough, they brought me cold meals in my room like I was an unwanted tenant. When I objected, Daniel simply said I was being dramatic, and that old age made me difficult, as if aging were a crime. That was my life for years: silence, obedience, shrinking into myself more and more, until the morning he tried to take my pension, and with that one act erased me completely. Something inside me finally broke, something that had been asleep for decades, and from that fracture rose a fire I had thought long extinguished. Ever since the night of the refrigerator, I have felt something unfamiliar inside me. A new and steady calm that feels like the echo of a woman finally waking up from a lifetime of silence. And I no longer cry for what I lost, but for what I am finally about to reclaim my dignity, because the old version of me, the Evelyn who begged for affection and made herself small so others could feel tall, died the moment my son opened that freezer door, and what remains now is someone different. A woman who learned that love should never be a wound, and that silence can sometimes be more powerful than any scream. When I look at myself in the mirror, I whisper softly, Evelyn, no one will ever take what belongs to you again. And for the first time in years, my voice does not tremble, because after 70 long years, one truth has finally carved itself into my bones. There is no betrayal more devastating than that of a child who forgets the mother who taught him how to love. Ever since that morning, the house in Willow Creek has become a minefield. No shouting, only glances heavy enough to bruise. And Camille stopped speaking to me, except to give orders while Daniel walked around pretending calm, though every movement carried a threat beneath it, a cold and voiceless anger simmering under his skin. One afternoon, I heard him from the garden telling someone on the phone that nothing was wrong, that it had only been a scare, that I was old and losing my mind. And I stood frozen behind the door listening to my own son erase my entire life with four careless words. She is old, she is losing it, as if my years of work and sacrifice and memory could be dismissed like dust on a shelf. That same night, they took away my house keys. Camille approached with her syrupy voice and told me it was for my own good because I was getting distracted and leaving doors open. And accidents could happen. That was the word they chose for my freedom now: accidents. From then on, my days slowed into heavy shadows. I ate breakfast alone with stale bread and reheated coffee, while they dined in the bright dining room, laughing and planning trips, and discussing futures in which my name no longer existed. And sometimes I heard them from my bedroom, their voices floating like ghosts from a life I was no longer part of. I spent hours staring out the window at the lemon tree Samuel, and I planted when Daniel was born. That tree which had survived storms and drought and violent pruning, yet still bore fruit year after year. And every time I looked at it, I whispered to myself, if the tree can stand then, so can I. One afternoon, someone tapped gently on the gate. It was my lifelong neighbor Elvira, hair cropped short, hands marked by years of nursing work. The same woman who had helped me bring Daniel into the world and held me when Samuel died and life felt unbearably heavy. Evelyn, she whispered, I haven't seen you in days. Are you all right? I told her quietly that I could not speak long, that they had taken my keys, and she looked at me with the kind of understanding that comes from a shared lifetime of sorrow. Then murmured that she would leave something in my mailbox and that I should check it later. That night, after the house settled into stillness, I went to the door and found a small cloth pouch in the mailbox. Inside it, an old phone with a flashlight and a tiny note that said, in case you need help. And when I pressed the phone to my chest, I realized I could not remember the last time someone had done something so simple and so human for me. In the days that followed, I pretended obedience, smiling sweetly and answering yes to everything. Yes, Camille, I took my pills. Yes, Daniel, the stove is off, letting their arrogance lull them into underestimating me, while behind that mask of frailty, my mind worked tirelessly. Only at night did I use the phone Elvira had given me, sending short messages back and forth, her asking if I was safe, and me replying that everything was under control, until one evening I gathered my courage and typed the request that made my fingers tremble. I need a favor, Elvira, something important, and after a long pause, she answered that she would do anything for me. The next morning, I pretended to feel sick, touching my forehead, walking slowly, complaining of dizziness until Camille, annoyed, called Daniel and insisted that they could not be responsible if I fainted or fell. Then keep her in the room, he said, let her rest. And so they locked me in, leaving only a glass of water and a tray of food with the phrase for your own good. They did not realize they were doing me a kindness because that room became my sanctuary. And in the place where they believed I was trapped, I began constructing my freedom. Inside the closet wall, I still kept the money Samuel had saved, gold coins and old bills wrapped carefully in paper, sleeping there for over 30 years waiting for a purpose, and now at last they had one. At night, I contacted Don Ramiro, an old friend of my husband and former bank manager, who sounded surprised to hear my voice and asked what was wrong, and I told him only that I needed to change the ownership of my account quietly. He warned me it would not be simple, and I reminded him that nothing meaningful ever is, and after a long breath he agreed, telling me to be careful. Do not worry, Ramiro, I whispered, no one will suspect. Night after night I recovered what was mine, weaving my justice with patience while Elvira secretly delivered small things, an envelope, a document, a banking seal, each piece fitting perfectly into an unseen thread that drew me closer to truth and revenge. During the day, I listened to Camille laughing on the phone making plans, and once I heard her say that once they sold this house, they would finally leave. And in my locked room, I clenched my teeth because she did not yet know that the house she planned to sell was slipping through her fingers and returning to the woman who had built it with her own life. I had always known their ambition would be their downfall, and my confinement lasted 3 long weeks before Daniel finally walked into my room one morning wearing a gentle, almost rehearsed look of concern. How are you feeling, Mom? He asked softly, and I answered that I felt much better. Speaking in a fragile voice that made him relax, and as he nodded with that mixture of pity and triumph, I saw his smile widen because he truly believed he had won unaware that I was about to return everything he had done to me with interest. That night, while the wind battered the windows, I opened my old notebook and wrote that they had taken my keys, but not my mind. They had locked up my body, but not my soul, and what a son steals out of greed, a mother can recover with patience. Then I turned off the light and slept peacefully for the first time in years, knowing that, when that locked door finally opened, it would not be me walking out as the prisoner. Silence has a sound only the elderly understand, not the absence of noise, but the presence of something forming beneath it. And that week the house felt too quiet, no laughter, no arguments, only whispers behind closed doors. Daniel and Camille stayed awake late, speaking in low, urgent tones, believing I slept, unaware that a mother's ears never close. My room faced the hallway, the thin wall letting every word filter through, and one night I heard Camille say impatiently that they could not keep waiting. That his mother would not last much longer, that if they continued this little game, the money would disappear. And Daniel tried to reassure her, saying that once I signed the sale papers, everything would be theirs, and that if I refused to sign, I would sign anyway. And then silence came, followed by the sound of her laughter, and her voice telling him he was just like his father, always knowing how to get what he wanted. And Daniel spat back that his father had been a fool who died poor. And she whispered that he would not die that way because he would do the right thing, and then their voices dissolved into kisses, while I lay in the darkness with my fists clenched so tightly, my nails cut into my palms. Realizing that my own son was planning to sell the house where Samuel and I built our life, and where every memory of love still lived, all while sleeping only meters from me. The next morning I rose early and prepared coffee as if nothing were wrong. And when Camille walked in with that hollow smile, she used to mask her poison. She asked if I had slept well, and I replied gently that I had dreamt of my husband, and she, distracted by her phone, said how lovely. Until I added that he had told me visitors were coming soon, perhaps people from the bank, and when she lifted her head sharply, I smiled and said that dreams cost nothing. I watched her swallow hard, her hand trembling slightly, and I knew fear had finally begun to bloom inside them. That afternoon, I used Elvira's phone to make a call. Ramiro, I whispered, prepare the papers. He asked if I was sure, and I answered that I had never been more certain. So, he promised to come the next morning for my signature, and assured me everything would remain in my name. I hung up with my heart racing, not from fear but from adrenaline, the same fire I had felt when I carried Daniel to the hospital as a baby, when Samuel lay feverish without medicine, the strength that rises only when you have nothing left to lose. That night, their voices again carried through the thin wall, sharper now, frayed with anxiety. What if the bank calls her without warning? Camille asked, and Daniel insisted they could not do anything without his authorization, calling me weak and slow. Saying I barely walked and had no idea what was happening, and I laughed silently, because if they knew how quickly I still thought they would tremble, and if they knew how much I heard, they would never speak near my door again. The next morning, after Daniel left for work, Camille stayed home and brought breakfast to my room, a gesture that might once have been kind but now smelled of pity mixed with threat, and she told me I needed to eat well. What a thoughtful gesture, dear, I answered, using the word dear like a blade, and she stiffened before announcing that in a few days we would receive life-changing news. I asked her what kind, and she only smiled with her back turned. When she left, I hid the plate under the bed, trusting my instincts, because the metallic taste in the food told me not everything in that house was safe anymore. That afternoon, Elvira slipped an envelope into my hands, saying quietly that Ramiro had prepared everything. Inside it, I found the document transferring the house fully to my name, with one more clause written in careful ink. In the event of my death, the property would go to a foundation for elderly women without homes, not to my son, not to his wife, but to others like me, to women who had been forgotten and silenced, just as they tried to silence me. And as I held the papers in my trembling hands, I felt the weight of a lifetime finally shift in my favor. I felt the tears roll down my cheeks as I whispered thank you to Elvira, and she shook her head, telling me not to thank her, only to promise that I would be careful, and I answered that I had always been careful, but now I would also be dangerous. That night, I wrote a letter and left it on my bedside table, beneath Samuel's portrait, a farewell for the world in case one day I did not wake up. Telling whoever found it not to cry for me, because I had not been a victim, but a witness of my own war, and I had won it without firing a single bullet. Then I placed another letter in the wardrobe meant for Daniel, explaining that if he ever read it, it would be because he had lost everything just as he had lost me. When he returned home later that evening, something in his face had shifted, a stillness too controlled, the calm that always arrives moments before violence. Mom, he said gently, tomorrow the people from the bank are coming. Oh, really? What a surprise, I answered softly. And he said they only needed my signature, nothing more. And I told him, of course, son, I'll sign whatever you want. And I watched his eyes light up as he took my hand with fabricated tenderness, believing finally that I had surrendered, and I smiled back, telling him that indeed I understood everything. After he went to sleep, I sat alone in the dim kitchen, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the same sound that had awakened the fire in me weeks earlier. And I thought of Samuel, who always said there are battles only won when the enemy is convinced he has already defeated you, and that phrase stayed with me until dawn, guiding me like a lantern. I prayed before sleeping, not for justice or revenge, but for clarity, because life had taught me that sometimes the greatest punishment is not death but remorse, and that would be the inheritance I left my son. The next day rose with a fragile calm that frightened me, the sky too clear, the air too still, the house seeming to hold its breath. Daniel and Camille had left early for the bank and had placed a folder of documents on the table, the same folder they believed would finalize their victory, and I sat before it for hours without touching it, studying it as though I could absorb its poison simply by looking. I knew its contents by heart: the sale of my home, the surrender of my accounts, the closing of whatever independence I still held, their final blow meant to be delivered through my own hand. And the delicious irony was that they were certain I would comply. By the time they returned, and the late afternoon sun stained the walls orange, Camille smelled of that expensive perfume that always made my stomach turn, and Daniel walked in with the arrogance of a man who believed the world had knelt before him. Mom, he said with that unfamiliar smile. Today is an important day, and Camille sat in front of me, pushing the folder toward me, telling me that only my signature was missing, and though my hands trembled, it was not fear, but the thrill of an actress preparing for her final act. I took the pen, opened the papers pretending to struggle to understand, and asked in a frail voice if they were really from the bank. And Daniel reassured me with that paternal tone he had adopted, as if speaking to a child telling me to trust him. And I replied that, of course, I trusted him, that I always had, and then I signed one page, then another, while Camille smirked with satisfaction at what she believed was my surrender. When they left the house to celebrate their victory over dinner, I went to my room, opened the wardrobe drawer, and pulled out the true documents, the ones Ramiro had prepared days earlier, the ones that nullified every signature. I had just placed the ones that restored my house, my accounts, and my dignity to their rightful owner. And while they had been drafting their deception, I had already finished mine. Ramiro had done everything with precision, telling me over the phone that, when they presented their papers, the system would show others, and that banks never argued with a retired schoolteacher who kept every receipt since 1983. I stored the official copies in a metal box alongside Samuel's photographs and my old savings passbook, each signature and stamp part of a quiet symphony building toward its crescendo. I slept little that night, listening as they returned home, laughing, clinking glasses. And from the hallway, I heard Camille say that tomorrow she would put the house up for sale, and Daniel told her to relax because he wanted the money transferred first. And when she asked about his mother, he paused before saying coldly that his mother had nothing left. And I closed my eyes and swore that would be the last time I heard him speak of me that way. At dawn, Elvira arrived, quickly disguised as a delivery worker, wearing a cap and carrying a bag of bread, and she slipped inside to hand me an envelope sealed with notary stamps, the words document registered written in blue ink. "Is everything ready?" she asked, and I told her yes, and we hugged like two tired, weathered women who had survived far more than anyone imagined. Elvira slipped out the back door just as I heard the front lock turn, and Daniel entered saying, "Today the real estate agent would arrive to evaluate the house." And I answered, "Oh, good, now they will finally know how much my life was worth." And he looked at me with that blend of irritation and contempt, and warned me not to ruin things, and I said, "I never ruin anything, son, I simply observe." That afternoon, the agent toured the house, taking photos and measurements, touching the walls Samuel once painted, running his fingertips along the doorframe, where his handwriting still faintly remained, stepping on the stairs where Daniel had taken his first steps, and I followed silently, feeling as though a stranger were dissecting my memories. When they finished, Camille signed a few papers and went outside to see him off while Daniel stayed behind reviewing the documents. "Are you happy, son?" I asked him as he flipped through the papers, and without looking at me, he said, "Of course. This will give us a better life," and I asked softly whether he meant a better life for him or for all of us. And he insisted everyone would benefit, then added casually that I would live in the nursing home we had visited with the bars on the windows, the one that smelled like bleach and resignation, and his silence after my comment was answer enough. I looked at him carefully and saw no love in his face, only a mask of ambition, and behind that mask, a darkness I no longer recognized. When night fell, I locked myself in my room, opened a small notebook, and wrote a single line: "Power does not belong to the one who commands, but to the one who waits." Then I played the radio, and one of Samuel's old favorite songs filled the room, and for a brief moment I felt peace. Before falling asleep, I made myself a promise that when everything collapsed, when the stage fell apart and the illusion shattered, I would not raise my voice because I would not need to. My silence would be louder than any scream. The next morning, Daniel received the call that would unravel everything. "What do you mean the documents aren't valid?" he yelled. "That's impossible." And from the hallway, I widened my eyes in innocent confusion, asking if something had happened. He turned toward me with fury and disbelief twisting his face, saying the bank claimed the property was in my name and nothing could be processed without my authorization. "How strange," I answered while pouring coffee. "Perhaps there was an error." "What did you do, Mom?" he shouted, and I replied that I did nothing except sign what he gave me. Wasn't that what he wanted? Camille burst into the room, frantic, saying the real estate agent had called and reported that the sale was frozen, and she added that the system listed the property as protected under a foundation contract. Daniel's face contorted, veins bulging like dry branches as he slammed the table, scattering papers, shouting my name, while I simply watched him in quiet calm. The mask has fallen, I thought later that afternoon as they argued and the phone rang incessantly, and I sat by the window with a cup of tea warmed by the soft sunlight. And for the first time in years, I felt the house belonged to me again. The next morning erupted in shouts mixed with the ringing phone, doors slamming, furious footsteps pounding through the house. I was in the kitchen stirring my coffee when Daniel stormed in with wild eyes demanding to know what I had done, screaming, "What the hell did you do?" And I asked gently what was wrong. He accused me of calling the bank, of altering documents, and I told him calmly that perhaps the bank had suspected something. Because I knew nothing of those complicated procedures, after all, I was old and slow. Wasn't that what he always said? His hands were shaking, his face red with rage. Camille came in behind him, pale and trembling, saying we are being investigated, that the bank had reported irregular activity, and someone had filed a complaint about forged signatures. Daniel whipped around and shouted at her, saying he told her to erase everything. He told her to do it right. And she stammered that it wasn't her fault, that it was me. That old woman planned everything. I let out a dry laugh, a sound that rose from the depths of years of swallowed humiliation. Of course I planned it, I said, and they stared at me in disbelief. What did you say? Daniel whispered, and I repeated that I had planned it from the day he took my keys. Silence filled the room so thickly even the clock didn't dare tick. Camille was the first to break, murmuring that it was impossible, that I had no way to do it. And I told her gently that when a woman spends 70 years solving life alone, she learns to do many things. Daniel stepped forward and shouted that I had ruined them, left them with nothing, and I told him, "No, my son, you ruined yourselves. You don't understand," he cried, "it was for your own good." My own good, I repeated with a louder laugh. My own good is not tied to money. My good is not having to look at my son and feel shame. His eyes burned with anger, and for a moment I thought he would hit me, but Camille grabbed his arm with shaking fingers and begged him not to dare. He shoved her hard, shouting at her to shut up, and she fell to the floor clutching her shoulder. I stood slowly, unhurried, and said, "Do you see, son, this is what you have done with your life. You have become exactly what you swore you'd never be. A man blinded by ambition, violent and small." Camille scrambled to her feet in tears and screamed at me not to look at her that way, calling me a witch, saying I had ruined everything, and I answered that I had only taken back what was mine. She yelled that I would pay for this and lunged for the phone, claiming she would call the police, and I told her what a wonderful idea, that she should tell them about the forged documents she herself had created. Her hand froze midair. Daniel stared at her in confusion. "What is she saying?" he demanded. Camille stayed silent, trembling. I stepped forward and told Daniel that he had been naive, that Camille had signed the first fraudulent documents in his name, that she was the one who pushed him to use my account, that she wanted the house more than he ever did. "That's not true," Camille muttered. "Don't listen to her." I told Daniel to check his email because everything was there, every copy, every signature. His face cracked with doubt, and that tiny hesitation was enough to destroy them both. Camille fled to the bedroom and locked the door, sobbing on the other side, and her crying was the sweetest music I had heard in years. Daniel collapsed into a chair with a hollow stare, and for the first time in a long time, I saw not the arrogant man who had humiliated me, but the lost child who once cried in my arms when the world scared him. "Why did you do it, Mom?" Daniel whispered, and I answered that they had left me with nothing. "I only wanted to help you," he insisted, and I told him he had not wanted to help me but to take everything I built with my life, and that was not help, that was theft. His tears began to fall, and although it hurt to see him break like that, I did not move toward him. It was his turn to feel what it meant to face the world alone. A few hours later, the police arrived. Curious neighbors gathered outside, sirens flashed, questions flooded the house. Camille tried to blame me, but the documents spoke louder than she ever could. The forged signatures, the transfers, the recorded calls, everything arranged in perfect order like a trap they had gladly walked into. The officers took Camille first as she screamed and cursed, and when Daniel tried to intervene, one of them told him he also needed to accompany them because there were complaints under his name. He looked at me before leaving with a gaze I will never forget. Not hatred, not love, only emptiness, as if he had suddenly understood what he had lost. When the house finally fell silent again, I sat in front of the refrigerator, opened the door, and found the old block of ice I had used that night, nearly melted now, but still holding inside it the first paper that had set everything in motion. I placed it on the table and watched it collapse slowly, drop by drop, like watching the past dissolve right before my eyes. I called Elvira and told her it was done, and she asked if I was all right, and I answered that I felt better than I had in years. She hesitated, then asked what I would do next. Live, Elvira, just live, I said, and she told me I deserved it. After hanging up, I stared at the lemon tree outside the window, still standing with new blossoms and fresh shoots, the same tree Samuel and I planted when Daniel was born. And it seemed both cruel and beautiful, at once a reminder that life continues even when the roots are hurt. Before going to bed, I looked in the mirror, and for the first time in years, recognized the woman staring back. Not the fragile, forgotten mother, but a woman who had survived everything and reclaimed justice without shedding a drop of blood. I wrote one final line in my notebook. In the end, I did not scream to be heard. I stayed silent, and that silence was my vengeance. Then I turned off the light and slept deeply, like someone who can finally close her eyes without fear. 3 weeks have passed since that morning, 3 weeks since the police took Daniel and Camille away, since the shouts filled the house and the whole neighborhood learned my story. Since then, the house has become mine again, but not the same as before. The silence that once wounded me now protected me. It was my shield, my peace, my way of breathing freely. Each day I rose early, made coffee, and opened all the windows to let the sunlight in. The curtains moved again with freedom, the old paintings returned to the walls, and the scent of jasmine filled the corners. It felt as though Samuel walked with me through the halls, smiling in every warm beam of light. Sometimes I sat on the porch to watch the lemon tree, its branches swaying with a tenderness that made me cry, crying not from anger but from relief. For the first time in years, my life belonged to me. One afternoon, Elvira arrived with an expression I could not read, her eyes wet, her steps slow. Evelyn, she said, placing her bag on the table, Daniel has been released. He signed an agreement with the judge. Camille confessed everything. He was partially exonerated. I nodded with no emotion, feeling neither hatred nor joy, only a serene emptiness. Do you know where he is? I asked, and she said they told her he was coming here. In that moment, I knew fate was not finished with me. It was dusk when I heard the soft knock on the door, not arrogant nor impatient, but timid, almost afraid. I opened it, and there stood my son, thinner, his face carved by guilt and shame, an old backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes sunken as if he had not slept in weeks. Mom, he whispered. I said nothing, only looked at him. For a moment I saw the child he once was, the little boy who hid behind my skirt when he was frightened, who fell asleep clutching my arm. He lowered his gaze and said he had not come to ask for anything, only to see me. And what does that change? I asked quietly. Nothing, he admitted, but I needed to do it. He stepped inside slowly, glancing around as though the house itself were confronting him, touching the back of a chair, the edge of the table, the stove where I had cooked all his childhood meals. Everything is the same, he murmured, and I replied that what changes is not always something you can see. He sat across from me, and for a long while neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavier than any words could be. Finally, he said I was right about everything, about Camille, about himself, about the greed that had devoured him. She used me, Mom, he whispered, and I said she had not done it alone, he had allowed her. He nodded, swallowing hard, saying he knew, saying he had been a coward, that he wanted everything and lost the only thing that mattered. And what was that? I asked. You, he said. For the first time in years, my eyes filled with tears, not from sorrow, but from the weight of hearing words I never thought would reach my ears. He leaned toward me and took my hand, his skin cold, and said, Forgive me, Mom. I cannot undo what I did. No, you cannot, I answered, but you can learn to live with it. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw sincerity in his eyes, the same honesty Samuel had whenever he made a mistake and came to apologize. A small spark of tenderness flickered in me, but it faded quickly because the wound was still there, deep and permanent. Where will you stay? I asked. I don't know, he said softly. I just wanted to see you. And now I'll go. I don't want to be a burden to you again. You were once a burden, son, I told him gently, do not become one again, and he lowered his head, saying he knew, but that if one day I ever wished to see him, and I interrupted him, saying that a son may lose everything, money, work, even love, but when he loses the respect of his mother, there is no path back. He nodded, holding back his tears, then rose slowly and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned and whispered, Thank you for staying alive. I didn't deserve that, and then he disappeared into the twilight. That night I sat on the porch beneath the cold stars, the wind rustling the lemon tree's branches like a lullaby, and in that simple sound, I found a strange comfort. Elvira came later wrapped in a blanket asking me quietly if he had said anything. And I told her yes, he thanked me for still being alive. And when she asked what I had answered, I told her nothing because sometimes silence is the only answer a mother has left to give. We remained there together in wordless companionship until she gently asked whether I had forgiven him. I thought for a long time before saying I didn't know, but I also didn't hate him, and perhaps that was the closest thing to forgiveness I could offer. Days later, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside it, a single photograph of Daniel sitting under the lemon tree taken before he left, and on the back, written in his unsteady handwriting, were the words, "You were always stronger than I believed." And I smiled not from joy, but from understanding because a mother's love does not disappear, it simply changes shape. That night, I wrote in my notebook that the fall of a son is not always heard. Sometimes it is only felt like the echo of a heart cracking but still beating. I closed the notebook and placed it beside Samuel's photographs, feeling the past settle, the wound finally close. Whether Daniel returned someday no longer mattered. I knew I would not be waiting. Winter arrived early that year, with colder mornings and grayer dawns, and that silent air only weary souls recognize, but for the first time, the cold did not hurt. It felt clean, like it washed what remained of the past. 6 months passed without a word from Daniel, and I did not expect one. Yet each morning when I made coffee, I still glanced toward the window with the strange sensation that he was out there, somewhere, breathing the same air as me, not with resentment, only distance, the distance needed for healing. After everything that had happened, I decided I did not want to die in silence or surrounded by empty memories, so I opened the doors of my house, truly opened them. One day, Elvira brought an elderly woman who had been crying in the plaza because her son had thrown her out, her eyes full of shame. And I let her in, made her tea, and without thinking told her she could stay a few days. Then another came and then another, and before I realized it, my home, the one my son had tried to sell beneath me, had become a refuge, a place for forgotten women, women life had treated as it once treated me, harshly but not fatally. Each night I heard them laughing, cooking, humming old tunes, and the house breathed again, alive, warm, full of stories, and in each of them I saw a small piece of myself. A local journalist visited after hearing people call it the House of the Brave. He asked me to share my story, and I laughed, telling him it was not a story of vengeance, but of memory that one day my son tried to take everything from me, my money, my home, my voice, and without knowing it, he returned what I should never have lost. My dignity. He listened, scribbling his notes, then asked whether I had forgiven my son. Forgiveness is not always an embrace, I said. Sometimes forgiveness is simply being able to say his name without your soul trembling. Every evening, I sit on the porch watching the lemon tree, still standing firm with its branches full of fruit. Sometimes Rosa, one of the women in the refuge, sits beside me and smiles, saying this tree never dies, and I do not reply because I know why. It is accustomed to surviving storms. She takes my hand in hers, and in that simple gesture I find everything I need. Elvira passed a month ago, her life dimming slowly like a candle that had already given its last light, and her final words to me were, "Don't let them forget you, Evelyn. Let them know an old woman can still change her destiny." I promised her I would, and I have kept it. Every woman who arrives hears my story not as a tragedy, but as a warning. Love should never hurt, not even when it comes from a child. On the coldest nights, I wake thinking I hear footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes I tell myself it is the wind, but other times I am certain it is Daniel, not entering, not asking for anything, only passing silently to make sure I am well. And though I never open the door, I smile, because the love between a mother and her child, even shattered, never disappears completely, it only changes form. Today I turned 71. The women of the refuge baked me a cake, hugged me, and wrote a message on a bright cardboard sign. "Thank you for giving us back hope, Evelyn." I asked for nothing more, because in those words lay everything I had ever sought: recognition, affection, peace. That night, when everyone was asleep, I sat before the fire and opened my notebook one last time. Its pages were full of crooked letters, smudges, dried tears, and I wrote, "I was not born to be a martyr, but to remind them that life does not end with pain, it reinvents itself. and that a mother may lose everything except the strength to rise again. I closed the notebook, covered myself with a blanket, and watched the fire crackle softly. Winter howled outside, relentless, but inside the house the warmth was human, the warmth of those who survive. I closed my eyes and whispered into the air, "Samuel, you may rest now. Your house is full again, not of money, but of life." And that is how my story ended, a story that began with humiliation and concluded with a quiet victory.